Order, order. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 10th of March, 2025. Cyber attack is one of the most serious risks facing the UK and can severely impact government operations and public services and people's lives. The government's cyber security strategy published in 2022 noted a large gap between where government cyber resilience is and where it needs to be. The cyber threat to government is severe and evolving rapidly. Government clearly needs to keep pace with this threat, but ageing legacy IT systems and shortages of cyber skills create significant challenges, which we'll be examining today. So we'll be looking at how the government understands the severity of cyber threat that it faces, how it can best achieve the aim of the strategy, and build government's resilience to cyber attacks. So to help us with all of that, we do warmly welcome you, Kat Little, the Permanent Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service, a regular attender at this committee, and you were appointed in 2024 following your previous role as Second Permanent Secretary at the Treasury. Vincent, Devine or Devine?
Devine.
Devine, I'm so sorry. It's better to ask at the beginning and get it right. Head of the Government Security Function and Government Chief Security Officer. You were appointed in 2021, December. Bella Powell, Cyber Director of Government Security Group, and Bella joined the Cabinet Office in September 22. And I think it's your first appearance before this committee, so a warm welcome to you. And from the Department of DSIT, Science and Innovation and Technology, Joanna Davinson. Joanna, we've seen you recently, so you're welcome again. You're the Interim Government Chief Digital Officer, and Joanna was previously Director General at the Centre of Digital and Data Office and Head of Digital and Data Function, so you're welcome from DSIT. So I think, and of course, a warm welcome to Lauren Edwards, member of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, who also do hearings in this space. So without any further ado, I'm going to start off, and I'm going to start off with you, Kat Little, if I may. There's an awful lot of different organisations and groups and everything else involved in this whole sphere of cyber. How do they all work with each other, and could the whole lot be streamlined?
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for having us this afternoon. I think the first thing to say is that this is an incredibly complex and team-based set of issues, and so it's important that our national security teams, the intelligence community, our technology experts, departments, and our security experts work very, very closely together. And I think there are questions always about what's the best structure, which I'll say a little bit more about. But actually the most important thing is how do we work together to make sure that those different experts are working as one team to manage the threat and to respond. When it comes to the different roles, the Cabinet Office is overall responsible for three big things. Firstly, the policy and strategy setting. Secondly, the functional standards that we expect people to apply. And thirdly, assurance. There are different roles for DSIT, which I won't go into all of the detail of, but obviously DSIT is looking much more broadly at the technical expertise that we have. And the National Cyber Security Centre is the lead for both response, for coordination, and also making sure that they are independently advising government on the threat and the assessment of the threat. It's very easy, I think, to say, well, surely you can combine all of these things and just do it all in one place. I'm quite sceptical, partly because you need to have the right political oversight and ministerial accountability, which, of course, you can't do within an arm's length body or through the UK intelligence community. That's not their direct function. And crucially, you need different expertise. This is so pervasive across so much of what government and the public sector does. I don't think it is right to assume that simple, streamlined governance is automatically the right answer. Having said that, we have done a lot of work to make sure that our accountabilities, responsibilities, and our ways of working are as effective as possible. And as you know, the recent machinery of government change, moving our digital and technology capability into DSIT, gave us a really good opportunity to do that. I'm sure there'll be further questions constantly asked about structures, but really, ultimately, that's a matter for the Prime Minister and for political colleagues.
Okay, and I don't mind which of you answers this question. Theoretically, I'm the Permanent Secretary of a department. It's a Monday morning. My phone is red hot people are ringing me saying that their systems are acting in an odd way or they're not acting at all. Who do I ring?
So let me start, because this is not an unfamiliar situation, as you might imagine. So we expect for their security teams to immediately pick up the phone to probably Bella, who will also instigate an urgent response across GC3, so the three parts of government that need to be notified and to react. But Bella should take it from there.
Sure, really happy to give a little bit more detail on that. So the cross-government response to incidents of that type is set out in the National Cyber Incident Management Framework. So that is a policy document which essentially sets out the totality of government's response to serious incidents of that type. So Government Security Group has a really important role to play within Cabinet Office. We're responsible through the GC3, so the Government Cyber Coordination Centre, in partnership with NCSC and the Government Digital Service, in helping departments to respond to that incident. So the PermSec would commission their security team to get in touch with the Government Cyber Coordination Centre, either directly via NCSC or to GC3 directly. They'll provide support to that organisation in immediate response. The National Cybersecurity Centre also has a critical role to play in providing broader technical advice, support and guidance, both to government organisations and to that individual organisation in helping it to respond. The National Cyber Incident Management Framework also sets out the process by which we would convene broader cross-government governance as necessary. So we have the COBRA process, which helps us to understand and to provide the sort of the cross-government set of actions, including things like attribution, understanding how broader public sector organisations need to respond to an incident, how we understand the sort of the overall impact and how we coordinate across wider government. So we have a really clear process in place, and we also have direct support to individual departments for how they can respond.
Would every permanent secretary know what to do in that situation? Absolutely backwards. They would. I see Cat Little's
I'm
nodding.
very confident of that, partly because I can't think of a single department that doesn't have cyber risk on their risk register, transparently set out along with the protocols. And we have very expert security teams who would be advising permanent secretaries if there were any sort of breach of this sort.
And maybe if I could just add to that, I mean, all departments have got CIOs, so Chief Information Officers, and generally the security teams are very well plugged into them. So a permanent secretary who needed advice would, I would imagine, go straight to their CIO,
Very helpful.
who would be able to guide them.
So I think I'm going to direct this to you, Vincent, Devine, if I may, please, and to ask you to tell us what you can in answer to this question. How worried should we be about the cyber threat to the government?
Well, I think we should be extremely worried. I think the NEO report sets that out very well. We've summarised the threat for the NEO. Over the last 3 years, the threat has grown and evolved. So our adversaries, so both hostile states and criminals, have developed capability more rapidly than we expected. Their risk appetite has changed, particularly some hostile states. I won't name names here. They've been more aggressive, more careless in their attacks than we'd expected. And finally, the nature of the threat, I think, is evolving. We've been principally concerned in the past about the loss of government information, classic espionage, or about cyber crime, again, information-based. We're also now worried about the risk of disruption of essential services. So I think that the fact that the threat has surprised us with its pace is really underpinning most of the analysis in this report.
Thank you. So what are some of the examples of cyber attacks? Just very briefly, one or two that are the sort of things that are happening at the edges of this whole scene at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can give you some examples. So if we think about the threat, we think about it in two broad categories. So firstly, ransomware and data extortion, as Vincent has set out. And secondly, nation-state attack. So for ransomware and data extortion, it tends to be perpetrated by organised criminal groups. A great example of the type of impact that can be felt by that type of attack is the attack on the British Library that occurred in October of 2023. The British Library are still recovering from that incident. So around 500,000 records were published on the dark web several terabytes of data were stolen. The majority of their server estate was encrypted, and they estimate now that it's cost them between 6 and 7 million in response costs, which is over 40% of their financial reserves to respond to that. The British Library have also been incredibly transparent about their response to that attack and the sort of the role that the amount of legacy technology that they had played in their resilience levels, and how that resulted in a greater impact than it would have done otherwise, which is a challenge that is really common to broader public sector organisations. So that's a great example of the impact of ransomware and organised criminal activity. On the nation state front, so we have two kind of categories that we are particularly concerned about there. In terms of espionage, a really good example of the type of action that we see there is a campaign of activity that was called out by the National Cybersecurity Centre last year by the Russian GRU. So that was a campaign of espionage activity that included data exfiltration, website defacement and data leakage activity, and is a really kind of clear insight into the scale of activity that is conducted by nation states, particularly for espionage. And on disruptive and disruptive activity, that is an area of increasing concern for us. So I believe it was in, I think it was February of 2024, the NCSC and their international partners co-signed an advisory warning of activity that had been identified by a group known as Volt Typhoon. So Volt Typhoon is a Chinese state-affiliated actor, and they have been identified as conducting pre-positioning activity on US critical national infrastructure, with the potential to kind of escalate that to disruptive and destructive activity. And that is a clear indicator of the scale of threats from Chinese state actors and from their intent to disrupt essential services.
So, in order to sort of put this hearing into public consciousness, can you give us an example of something that's really affected the public? It's all very well affecting the functioning of departments and government next steps agencies and so on, ALBs, but something that's really affected the public.
I think the ransomware incident that impacted the Synovis pathology lab is a great example of that. So whilst that was kind of a component of the supply chain to public sector, actually the direct impact on individuals was really quite substantial. So over 10,000 NHS appointments were disrupted, and significant amounts of data were put at risk as part of that incident. We've seen several examples of that ilk where an incident has impacted a supply chain organisation. So, in some instances, several layers down the supply chain, and that has had a direct impact. We've also seen in slightly slower time, a couple of years ago now, the incident impacting Hackney Council, which had a direct impact on individuals within that area, where several public services were disrupted for a period of months. Redcar and Cleveland Council similarly had a quite significant impact as a result of a ransomware attack, which disrupted services to that local authority and to individuals in that area.
Well, thank you very much. Chris Kane.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from the Chair's question, do you think the public is seeping into the consciousness? I'm sort of, it always strikes me when we talk about cyber that you're describing attacks from countries, you're typing big things, deployments. Do you think the public is getting into the consciousness as much as it needs to?
I think they are, and others should add to this, partly because we're seeing cybercrime and cyber fraud increase significantly over the last 5 to 10 years. That is now one of the biggest categories of crime that we're dealing with at large. And also, it's not just the government and the public sector. We're seeing increasingly this impact on other parts of the economy. So, there are several banks who've also had challenges with cyber. So, all parts of our lives, whether it's public or state-run or whether it's private sector, is seeing increasingly the threats evolve and take place.
So let's talk about the evolution and the constantly evolving nature. What assurance can you give us that government can keep up with, is keeping up with, and ultimately is staying ahead of that growing and changing threat?
If I could start, and I'll turn to Vincent and Bella. I think the first thing to say is that, as Vincent described, the threat has significantly evolved. It's become more sophisticated. The circumstances have changed very, very rapidly. And if I look back over the last few years, we already had a gap in our ability to respond. So in order to keep pace, we are having to work 2-3 times as hard to evolve and to constantly be as on the front foot as we can. But my honest assessment of this is I think there always will be a gap. And no matter how quickly we close down some of our risks and we mitigate some of those risks, I think the ability for us to keep up is increasingly challenging. And I wouldn't want the committee to think that we're not trying to close that gap, but you're running against the tide constantly. And the Chair commented on some of the challenges that make it particularly difficult in government. The state of our legacy IT, the scale of it, the complexity of it, is a very serious issue, as is our ability to recruit, retain and develop the right skills at the pace we would like to, and I'm sure we'll come back to these topics. So I think we have a genuine challenge on how we keep pace, and I think our best effort is to keep evolving, to close that gap as much as we can, and to do it in the best value for money way that we can with taxpayer resources. But Vincent, another
Yes, I was going to say, Vincent, Devine, do you want to just comment on it?
Just very briefly, but actually Bella's maybe in better. I mean, in the sense we're in the kind of technology race that colleagues in defence will be very familiar with over the last 50 years. We can't say to you that we have a plan, we have a set of proposals that will guarantee our security for the next 5 to 10 years. We'll need to keep evolving those as our understanding of the threat develops. I'm sure the threat will continue to grow. Our challenge is to ensure that the risk at best remains flat or reduces. So it's about understanding the threat, developing responses and managing down the risk, and that's what we aim to do. But we need to be very honest, as Kat said, we can't offer you any assurance that we fully understand the future evolution of the threat or that we can always stay ahead of it. It's about mitigating it. Bella, if you'd want to change it.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, I think the NAO report quite rightly points out that at the moment we are not responding to the scale of the threat that we see. Our resilience levels are not sufficient to be able to respond to it. But I think when we think about the evolution of the threat, that's why it is so important for us to focus on resilience as a concept. So the way that we deal with an ever-evolving threat landscape where we don't necessarily know how a threat actor is going to change or what new technology is going to be available or what new tactics, techniques and procedures might be employed, is to focus on layered controls and layered resilience, which is why the government cybersecurity strategy sets out a framework that is very closely tied to the NCSC's cyber assessment framework and the resilience outcomes that are defined there. If we can achieve that set of layered controls, even if the threat environment evolves, we are then able to have multiple kind of layers of either we detect an issue or we respond effectively to it, or we have appropriate recovery plans in place if an attack is successful. We are, again, as set out in the NAO's report, we are not in a place where we are at those resilience levels right now, but that's why that resilience approach is so critical.
I sort of break down my question a little bit, perhaps. My question was what assurance can you give us the government can keep up with or stay ahead? So let's kind of break it down, because what I heard there is staying ahead of the threat is nigh on impossible, reacting to it because you don't know what the threat is going to evolve into. So let's park that bit for a minute and talk about the keeping up with the threat as it's evolving. Are you in the race? You're not getting significantly behind, and you're not finding that those that would do us harm are pulling away. You're in the race, and you're keeping in the race.
Absolutely. So our National Cyber Security Centre is one of the most advanced organisations for understanding and assessing the threat. And we obviously work as part of a global community. We're not in isolation. We're using all the best intelligence that we have to assess the evolution of that threat. And the brilliant work of my colleagues here is to do everything we can to be agile in responding, mitigating. But fundamentally, we're in the race. We're pretty good at what we do, but staying in that race and staying at the top of the pack is a constant challenge.
And can I ask you about AI? We're talking an awful lot about AI in pretty much every session at the moment. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about AI and the cyber threat. I suppose I just want to leave it as almost an open-ended question for comment from you. How is it impacting? And what's your thinking around AI at the moment with cyber security?
Well, one comment from me, and experts should add to this, and particularly Joanna, but ultimately AI is built on and utilising data on a technology stack, and so fundamentally we need to make sure that the technology stack it sits on is as secure, resilient and is secure and fixed forward to be ready for AI. And I think a lot of this comes back to the conversations we've been having about legacy IT, because if we're deploying AI on top of technology stacks that are not resilient and are not secure, obviously we need to manage those vulnerabilities effectively. But obviously Joanna's our expert.
Yeah, I mean, just say, AI presents an enormous opportunity, but it does also mean we've got to be very thoughtful about how we manage our technology risk. And one of the key things that we are now doing is looking at secure by design. So we have an approach to ensuring that all new development, technology development across government, is secure by design. So that has a set of principles behind it around how you build security into new capabilities as you create them, and that's the key control that will enable us to ensure that going forward we will actually have secure and resilient systems. The legacy issue is a whole other set of challenges that we need to deal with. Yeah.
I suppose just to close that off very quickly, Chair, because we could spend forever talking about AI in every session that we do. I see AI being used to cure diseases, and find that it feels like AI is approaching things in a way that humans can't do it. Are we heading to a world where you're going to have a AI? The threat actors are going to be just setting AI loose to try and find weaknesses, and you're going to be setting AI loose to try and find the solutions. It's almost going to be a human hands-off approach. It must be a massive challenge and a massive change.
That is broadly, I think we've put our formal assessment of the impact of AI into the public domain. AI will not create new threats. It will exacerbate the threats that are already out there. So our adversaries will be able to use that AI to probe our defences. They'll be able to use AI to write coding, to challenge. They'll be able to use AI in other ways that damage government, such as misinformation. AI will also, if we introduce it wrongly, create new vulnerabilities for us. I think we're pretty confident we understand the risk there, and we won't create those new vulnerabilities. And then the third leg is we need to use AI as part of the defence. So as our adversaries are using AI to probe us, I think we are developing ideas how we can use AI to monitor, protect, detect, and potentially hunt down attacks.
I think we could spend forever on this.
No, I think between you've done what is needed on AI at the moment. Anyway, Clive Betts.
Right, coming to the issue of, you mentioned the skills and the challenges there, and not having enough skilled people to meet the challenges that departments have. I see today in the Times there's going to be recruitment of push to double IT experts in the civil service, but given we've had challenges to recruit more IT experts for the last 10 years and it hasn't been successful, why should we believe that the new attempt should be successful?
First thing to say is that we have been successful at significantly expanding the number of technical and digital experts within government, and I'm sure Joanna will want to add to this. But if you look at the size and scale of digital expertise in government, we're now up to 23,000 people within our technical teams. That is a massive shift. So I would refute the basis that we've not been successful. That is a massive endeavour for us. And so in specifically in relation to cyber skills, it is a challenge for the whole of the economy. This is not just a public sector or central government issue. I think a couple of years ago we published a report in government that set out that there are large vacancies in the private sector as well as in government. And so the things that we need to do is, one, grow more of our talent from within, and that's why we've got our cyber fast stream. We've got the tech track, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is a doubling of our apprentices working in technology. We have a new digital pay framework, which is designed to be much more competitive and to attract people into government based on the quality and the variety of the work that you get to do here. That is starting to have an impact. So I think it's right that the government is being ambitious and saying that we need to double the number. 1 in 10 is absolutely where we need to get to, and it's a combination of things that I think will contribute to that being a realistic and necessary thing for us to do within the civil service.
Coming back to your concern that I said you hadn't been successful, should we say you haven't been fully successful, because I think the report that we have in front of us today identifies 751 cybersecurity vacancies. There's a limit to success at present, isn't there?
Yeah, we would like to be more successful. So look, there are significant vacancies, particularly on cyber skills and particularly in the very high-end cyber skills that we need, things like penetration testing, some of the risk management work that we need to do. It saddens me that we are far too reliant on contractors and bringing in external expertise. So what that vacancy is really showing is that we're filling the gaps through the use of expensive private sector expertise to come and help us deliver this work in government, which is why it's so important that we build that talent and scale up our activity. But Joanna should comment on this.
I think you said it. I mean, the overall number of digital data and technology professionals in the civil service has grown. So we're now at nearly 6% across the whole of the civil service. It's not as much as we'd like it to be, but as Kat says, we're really struggling with the very technical resources, and that's a market problem. I mean, they're scarce in the private sector as well as in the public sector, and so we're competing in a hot market for those skills. So we've got a range of initiatives to address that, particularly around our early talent approaches and how we're developing the digital data and technology pay framework to ensure that we can reward those very hard to recruit skills at closer to market rate.
In terms of numbers, 751, the number of vacancies you have, some of which are filled by external agency workers, consultants coming in. That's the figure, is it? That those are partly filled, or is that the number?
They are partly filled by external support, yes.
How many vacancies have you got then, which are literally vacant and no one filling them?
You have to come back and write.
Sorry, we'll just quickly flick through to see if we've got that data today. As you can imagine, this is every single week we'll have different stats and different data on vacancies.
So, some idea would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, we can set that out.
And if we, in the meantime, just come back and... So why is there a gap at all? I mean, I think some of the comments to the the report were civil service recruitment procedures. If that's what it is, why aren't they changed?
So, if I comment on civil service recruitment, and there's a specific thing for technology as well. So, as you know, and the committee's looked at this in multiple different ways, the civil service time to recruit has not been good enough. And on average, we had some data a couple of years ago that suggested it took up to 9 months to recruit some of the technology specialists that we needed. That was absolutely recognised at the time, and my central HR team have been relentlessly focused on reducing the time to recruit. And we have been piloting different methods, different uses of technology, different ways of attracting people, so that we can shorten that time. We've just done a pilot in my own department where we've managed to get it down to 2 weeks. So that is a fundamental thing for the whole of the civil service, not just for tech expertise. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps if I come back on the previous point, so we don't have the detailed information on the 700 odd roles that you defined, but the overarching figure, and we can come back in writing on that, the overarching statistic that I think really lays out the scale of the problem is that 1 in 3 roles, 1 in 3 cybersecurity roles across government are currently either vacant or filled by a contractor, so that gives a really clear view of the scale of the challenge. I would also call out, though, that one of the things that we've recognised we can be much better at doing is tapping into currently untapped pools of talent. So the cybersecurity community and actually the digital and data community across government is currently not a diverse community. Something like 20% of cybersecurity individuals are made up of women, according to our current stats. It is not a diverse community right now. We can get much better at pulling into those broader broader pools of talent. We have a really fantastic initiative that's being run for us, piloted for us this financial year by the Department for Work and Pensions, building on one of their existing initiatives called the Government Cybersecurity Academy. That had 21,000 applications for essentially a reskilling programme for individuals coming from different careers and wanting a career in cyber. It also has excellent statistics in terms of representation of different diverse groups. We can get much better at bringing in those broader pools of talent, and I think that's one of the key levers for us in understanding how we can tackle the scale of the skills gap that we have currently.
Just a couple of follow-ups. I mean, you mentioned one example there, Department of Work and Pensions. How far are you therefore working across government to try and address this, rather than letting each department do its own recruitment in a very particular way?
So we have a number of central initiatives already underway. So Kat's mentioned a number of them, including the DDAP Pay Framework, which is a cross-government initiative, the apprenticeships programmes, which we already have in place, and also the Cyber Fast Stream. The DWP Academy that's being run is being run on behalf of the whole of government. So the graduates from that programme will be deployed across government. That's part of essentially a broader approach that we are taking to step up our transformation across government from a cyber perspective. We are taking a much more interventionist approach from the centre as part of our response to our understanding of current resilience levels to kind of change the way that we deliver across government, and a new series of skills interventions, of which the Cyber Academy is one, will help us to really kind of tackle the scale of the risk that we see at the moment and those skills gaps.
Coming back to the point about civil service process and procedures, is it really that the fact that historically the civil service have tried to recruit highly specialist technically skilled staff with a very restricted pay regime because it doesn't want to enhance the pay of everybody, and it won't do that just for the digital experts?
Well, that's exactly why we've brought in a specific digital pay framework. I can't tell you that it is, matching what some of these experts would get in the private sector, but it is certainly much more competitive. And I think the civil service has got to be much more targeted and segmented in order to get the right specialists to come and join us. We can't kid ourselves into thinking that people will join on the same salaries as the rest of government.
Okay. No doubt you'll get the headlines about some expert being paid more than the Prime Minister, but we're just going to live with that.
I can assure you that will need to be the case in order to attract and Joanna's on several recruitment panels at the moment for our most senior chief information officers in government. We have got to pay these people more. They are very, very scarce competitive skills in a very hot market, and if we're going to deliver on our ambitions, we need the leadership and the technical expertise there to do it.
And it's worth noting, it will still be significantly cheaper than using contractors, which is what we're driven to do at the moment. And it will be a cost saving in the longer term if we prevent some of the risks that we're talking about actually maturing.
Thank you, Clive. Contrary to what many people think, we're here to help the government. So whilst we're critical when the government gets things wrong, we should equally be complimentary when they get it right. So just to sort of upgrade you on what you said, in paragraph 2.4 on page 24, when CSG set up the Cyber Directorate, 32% of the roles it planned to recruit were vacant. By May 24, this improved to around 12% of the roles vacant. So that was exactly in line with what you said, Kat Little. Indeed. And it was a significant and welcome improvement at the centre, I think, but we're still obviously way down in some of the departmental roles, I think.
And if you don't mind me expanding, this is real credit to Vincent and Bella, and actually Joanna at the time, in the Cabinet Office. We basically set up a whole new cyber directorate, and we're now at full complement. We've got some brilliant experts that we've been able to attract from all sorts of different backgrounds. And those people are doing a really tough job against very, very difficult circumstances. In 2022, we had, the tragic circumstances in Ukraine. The threat picture increased dramatically at the same time as we were trying to set up a new organisation and to get it set up for success. So, it's real credit to Bella and my colleagues on this panel that we've been able to do that.
Indeed.
I also think, Chair, that it's worth really noting what you just said about the costs, in terms of it's not just how much people get paid, it's actually how much money in the long term you save. I mean, you cited the British Library, which costs 40% of their reserves. I can't remember what you said, it was £6 or £7 million, and that is a drop in the ocean of what it would cost this country if there were any cyber breaches. So I think people have just got to grow up, and if there are members of the media listening to this, grow up.
Never understated, Rachel.
Never knowingly undersold.
Luke, Charterist, please.
Thank you for coming. We've had that discussion about recruitment, and that's of course a key component to increasing the government's capability across Whitehall. But also we've got to pivot existing civil servants' skills and time in terms of what they spend their day to day on. Do you agree with the thesis that for every hour a civil servant spends on photocopying and using a fax machine, it's an hour less that we could be using for productivity when it comes to our cyber defence?
I totally agree with that. I mean, part of our work at the moment is to prioritise making the civil service, all of the public sector, much more productive and much more agile. Like, people join the public sector because they want to make this country a better place. They want to serve citizens and they want to deliver the very best outcomes for the people of this country. Our own people get very frustrated when they're bogged down in bureaucracy and inefficiency and they don't have the tools to do their job. So given where we're coming from, we have got to invest in the right tools and services to deliver better services to citizens. But we've also got to upskill the public sector, and that's partly about giving them the right technology, everything from issuing the right laptops, the right interoperability with other government departments. But it's also about just saying, if you are spending your time filling in forms, trying to get permission to do sensible things, we've got to cut that sort of stuff out, because that is not every hour that should be spent with citizens on the front line.
Are you willing to lead by example and get rid of photocopiers in the Cabinet Office and go fully digital?
I am certainly taking on the challenge of doing much more digitally, and actually normally I don't carry papers around with me. I do for hearings like this. Normally I just use my laptop. It really pains me to see huge amounts of paper copies being printed out when you could do these things digitally much more effectively.
On fax, just before I move on, time for a moratorium on the use of fax across the entire public sector.
I'm not sure if I can commit to that, but I certainly think, most people, and by the way, I don't think I've ever used a fax machine. Most of our staff don't even know what a fax machine is.
Know what it looked like.
And I remember coming to the civil service and going to a legal body and being told, there's a microfiche over there, and I'd never seen a microfiche before. So, it is absolutely right that we are using modern 21st century technology and phasing out anything that doesn't increase productivity.
Well, moving on then, swiftly on. The director of NCSC, Dr. Richard Horne, said in December the severity of the cyber risk facing the UK is being widely underestimated. He was really, in his remarks there, referring to the public and private sectors. Historically, do you think departments have underestimated the cyber risk?
I'll let my colleagues start.
Do you want to come, Bella?
Yeah, I'm really happy to. I think what it's very reasonable to say is that until recently, we have not done a great job of making sure that leaders across government have the right level of understanding of the scale of threat. We've made some significant changes in that, particularly over the last 3 years, ensuring that seniors across government have a really clear picture of what the threat environment looks like. But probably more importantly, we have only recently started to give a really clear picture to senior leaders across government of what we expect of them, so what the kind of required resilience levels are to be able to respond effectively to that threat. So as part of the government cybersecurity strategy, we've set very clear targets at cross-government level for organisations to improve their resilience levels, and we've also codified those against the NCSC cyber assessment framework. But that is a recent improvement, and it's we launched GovAssure in April of 2023, and that was the first time we really set out those concrete, objective requirements for government departments in terms of the resilience levels that they need to achieve in order to be able to respond effectively to threats. So I think part of the challenge is getting to a very concrete and measurable measurable set of outcomes that permanent secretaries can prioritise appropriately. And I think we're in a much better space now as a result of that.
So you'd freely admit that only until relatively recently were departments accepting and understanding the risk from hostile states and so on?
I think that's absolutely reasonable to state, but I think it's also worth noting that this environment has changed very, very rapidly, particularly over the last 3 years. We've seen a substantial escalation in threats. The technology environment has changed enormously, and the government cybersecurity strategy is our response to that. But you're absolutely right. There has been quite significant work over the last 3 years to improve that position.
And if I can turn to something in the NAO report about leadership, which is on page 16. And one of in the summary section there, accounting officers should ensure that the membership of senior decision-making boards should include at least one digital leader with cyber expertise. I'm sure you agree with that. Could you just comment on your own board in the Cabinet Office, Permanent Secretary? Do you feel as though you've got that level of expertise and you're leading from the front?
Well, I obviously very much agree with it. I actually currently don't have a full board in the Cabinet Office because, as you may be aware, we're currently recruiting to a whole new set of non-executives, but we have mandated in our recruitment process that we are looking for at least one digital and tech expert to join our board. And we expect the same of every other government department.
Perfect answer, thank you. Well, I'll turn us to perhaps some of your leadership role with respect to other departments, and of course one of the most concerning cases was the Synovus attack, and really my question is, do you feel as though, and I know you're not from DHSC, but do you feel like departments such as DHSC are properly responding to some of the threat potentially from state-based actors and hostile states? You know, it's these sorts of NHS attacks that could affect my constituents in York.
Yeah. Well, look, Bella said a little bit about the increase in education and understanding. One of the first things that I did when I took on this post last year was to convene all of the permanent secretaries together to talk about cyber risk. And one, to make sure we all understood the sort of threats that were out there, but also to talk about our responsibilities, because, as you know, under our accountabilities, accounting officers and permanent secretaries are responsible for the overall control environment, the reporting, the risk mitigation, and for making sure that they've got the right resources to take action. And under the new GovAssure arrangements, to make sure that they have a plan to close the gaps that we've identified. I've also recently written to permanent secretaries reminding them of their duties and the sorts of things we should do together to help to manage the risks. I very much believe that my permanent secretary colleagues not only understand the risks, but take it very, very seriously. And, you know, as we get into the spending review, where choices have to be made about where you allocate scarce resources for technology, for legacy IT, for managing cyber risk, it is the very top of departments who are involved in those conversations.
And finally, if I may, Chair, do you feel as though there's a growing risk from Russian cybercrime groups to our NHS?
I think it's absolutely right to say that Russia poses a substantial risk, so not just to health sector organisations, but more generally. So we see Russia and China as both, from a nation-state perspective, substantial risks. Russia tends to be an irresponsible actor, so the NCSC describes them as in that context. And what that means in practice is that there may be significant impacts across a number of organisations from a UK perspective. And happy to provide more detail in writing if that's helpful.
Luke, thank you very much indeed. Just before I bring Lauren Edwards in, I'd just like to follow up on one of Luke's questions, perhaps for you, Kat Little, and maybe for Joanna Davinson. And it's this. We've discussed in this committee many times before the need to have a chief digital and data officer at a senior level in a department. Surely we should equally be wanting a chief security officer or a chief cyber officer, whatever you like to call them, at the same level, at a senior level in the department. and talking to each other very closely indeed about matters of procurement and about matters of security. It's a cultural change in all departments, all government next steps agencies that we're about, is it not? And how are we going to do this?
Yeah, I very much agree with the premise of that. I suppose just before I hand over to Joanna, there are very different scales and different levels of threat in different departments. And actually one of the biggest challenges if you're a small department is recruiting any cyber experts, because we tend to be able to recruit very top-end people into organisations like MOD, the Home Office, really exciting, different sort of environments to work in. But if you're a small policy department, that is less appealing to quite a lot of people. So the premise of we should have very senior people accountable and at the very top end of the sort of expertise proportionate to the risk that a department has, I think is absolutely right. And the recent DSIP publication on the state of digital government set out for the need to have a very senior CIO in every single department as standard. But Joanna should add to that.
No, I think you said it. I mean, the State of Digital Government report did actually clearly show that although we have some departments with Chief Information Officer, Chief Security Officers at ExCo level, it's actually very few. And so there is still work to be done to work with other departments to ensure that they've got an accountable individual who has the experience and who has the capability to advise the ExCo and the board on matters of information technology and security. And that's one of the reasons why I'm now spending quite a lot of my time supporting departments to actually interview for senior leaders across government, because it's also, I think, really important that we get a good and consistent standard as well as in terms of the skills and capabilities of those individuals.
Can I just challenge one little tiny part of your answer, and it's this. You may be a small department, let's take DEFRA for example, but you probably, if you're a small department, haven't invested a lot over the last few years in legacy equipment. And therefore your likelihood of being subject to a cyber attack is greater because it's easier to do. And even a small department like DEFRA, if it seriously went down, would inconvenience a lot of members of the public.
Sorry, just to clarify, I'm saying that it's more challenging for smaller departments to recruit. And if you take DEFRA as a good example, where you've got a second permanent secretary and a director general who are accountable and responsible for bringing together technology and cyber issues. So my point is more that it should be proportionate to risk. And it's a challenge as it is to recruit the chief information officers that we are trying to bring into government. So I think we've got to be realistic about whether we can attract the very best cyber people and where we deploy them to have the maximum impact.
Warren Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for coming here today. The NEO report, I think in paragraph 4.9, raises some concerns around departments being reluctant to share information about their cyber incidents with other parts of government. This is sort of a common theme that I'm discovering a little bit with Whitehall. This almost sort of GDPR being used as kind of computer says no kind of response. And obviously it's quite a challenge, particularly when you have a new government that's very focused on its missions, a large part of which are obviously cross-departmental. Obviously it's particularly concerning for cyber incidents because, as I think Bella mentioned, we have the example of the British Library being really transparent about theirs and all the lessons that were learnt from that. So obviously a bit of a concern that that's not happening in Whitehall and information isn't being shared. So a question for Kat really, in your view, what's the impact of departments not sharing this information about cyber incidents?
Well, firstly, sharing data, as to your point, in a mission-led environment is so critical. It is essential, and particularly for cyber, where we want to learn lessons and we want to look at vulnerability, share best practice and work out what has gone wrong. So we need that openness from a humble and sharing perspective. There are sometimes good reasons for why departments aren't able to provide that information or are concerned about reputational damage, and it's our job in the centre to really challenge, because generally we know what has happened, to really challenge those departments on their risk appetite and to help them to manage any risks or concerns that they're worried about. But this I think connects to one of our previous hearings on just the culture and approach to data. Like we tend to take quite a risk-adverse attitude, and we're not going to learn and we're not going to do our very best to get insight if we don't take a much more front-footed approach. So the work that Joanna's departments are doing on the National Data Library, on breaking down those barriers to sharing data, is absolutely essential.
I'll just come in on the back of, Lauren. You're one of the most security conscious parts of government. So surely even if there was a reputational risk or if there was a security issue, and we're not going about publishing necessarily these incidents, but actually sharing the data and sharing what happened is surely critically important that it is shared with your department.
I can only agree with you, and especially when we're trying to coordinate and respond to what could be. I mean, it's quite often one of our jobs is to work out whether or not there is a consolidated attack on different parts of government, so it's essential. But Vincent and Bella have to live with this day to day.
Well, it's important to reassure you first that we do obviously ensure if there's a vulnerability exposed by the attack, we share that immediately, and if there's an impact beyond the department on other departments or individuals, we share that too. But equally recognise we would like to be more transparent in sharing incidents, both because there's a lesson learned element of it for all departments, but there's also a strong kind of human element to permanent secretaries, hearing how other permanent secretaries experienced an incident. One of the most powerful meetings I've attended in this role was when a chief executive of one of our big companies got round the table with other chief executives and talked them through an incident that he had experienced, just how real it was, how dangerous it was, how expensive it was for the company. So we absolutely agree we should be more transparent. We're continuing to work on that. But I just wanted to reassure you that we do obviously share immediately where there's potential impact on another department, either on its systems or on its people. Yeah.
If I may, just on that point, so the Government Cyber Coordination Centre is an initiative that we've launched relatively recently, so back in September of 2023. And actually through that joint initiative, we have made some really strong progress, particularly on allowing ourselves as government organisations to defend better as one, as opposed to in silos, and to share information more effectively across various organisations. So the GC3 is effectively our operational response team that draws in capability from across the National Cybersecurity Centre, the Cabinet Office and the Government Digital Service, and works with departments to respond to threats, vulnerabilities and incidents. And we have seen some really great progress there, particularly in improving transparency, increasing the flow of information and being more data-driven in our response.
Thank you. I mean, that sort of preempts one of my questions, which is what are the practical structures that you have in place to disseminate this kind of information? So the information about the coordination centre is helpful. How do you ensure that that's disseminated, not just to permanent secretaries, but throughout the departments themselves?
So one of the most important components of the Government Cyber Coordination Centre is the communities that it's built upon. So one of our immediate, so we have 4 strands of activity within the Coordination Centre. We have response to incidents, response to vulnerabilities, understanding of threats, and then also building communities across government. So part of the challenge for us has been being able to bring network defenders together in the context where they can share understanding, share technical expertise, but also share information in response to an incident. So those communities and sort of bringing those individuals together who are at the coalface of response to incidents has been a really, really important priority for us. We're still in the early stages of making sure that we have the right collaboration platforms, the right kind of dissemination mechanisms for individuals across government to be able to communicate effectively together. But that has already been a really powerful step for us in bringing those individuals together. And GC3 is very much the intent is it is built by network defenders for network defenders to help them to collaborate more effectively together.
Thank you. Just a final question for Kat. You discussed sort of culture change earlier and the need for that, which I completely agree with. How are you trying to embed that culture where it's mistakes or breaches of cyber policy are not seen as part of a kind of blame culture, which means that people don't raise them, but actually people are encouraged to come forward and learn from near misses? How are you trying to embed that, not just within the Cabinet Office, but throughout Whitehall?
Well, I think this is one of our biggest cultural priorities, and as the department who oversees inquiries policy in particular, the thing that we have really tragically learnt from a range of inquiries is that we have got to make it much easier for all of our public sector staff to raise a flag when things don't look right, aren't going well, and to be able to accept that, you know, we carry a lot of risk, and it's only right and proper that we talk about it openly when we make mistakes. And when government is responsible for so many things that could go wrong, because by default we're dealing with very complex and difficult issues, it matters even more. So I think the tone starts from the top, and, you know, myself and the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster have spoken openly in the Cabinet Office about the importance of testing and learning and accepting that we're going to fail and get things wrong. That's okay. It is absolutely okay. And I need every line manager in the civil service to have the backs of their staff on the front line and to go and said, don't worry about it. We will make mistakes. As long as we learn and we share what we're going to do differently, that is the most important thing. And I often use the example of, I think, in my first 8 weeks in this role, I think I wrote to the committee probably 3 times to apologise for something that my department did and to set out what we're going to learn from it and what we're going to do differently. I should say to this committee that quite often committees and having to come and explain ourselves is used as a reason why people are worried to say I've got something wrong, because they think they're going to be hauled in front of a committee to be told off. So I think the more that we can make it normal for us to correspond, to come and talk to you, to say we haven't got everything perfect, but this is what we're doing about it, and to create the conditions for that sort of culture, the better. But I think it's really hard because of the complexity and the scale of what government does.
I mean, that's really helpful, and particularly to have that leadership right from the top within the Cabinet Office. Do you think that that's permeated through all the other departments across Whitehall yet?
I think it's inconsistent is probably the straight answer. Because, you know, your risk appetite for failure is very different depending on the environment you're working in and the services you offer. We're a very large, complex set of different organisations, so I think it will take a while for us to be able to say confidently that every member of the civil service is able to put their hand up, admit mistakes, to learn from it, and to know that they're safe to do so. Obviously, our annual people survey, the pulse surveys that we run, are really critical in us understanding whether we're shifting the dial.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a really important question. Thank you. Rachel Gilmore.
Referring to what you've just said, you know, my party leader, Ed Davey, said exactly that to me when I signed a letter supporting the wealth tax by accident. So I wholeheartedly endorse that kind of leadership. So as you've admitted, the timeline for some of your ambitions is, I think, tight, particularly the 2025 one. So what are the implications of the critical functions of the government not being cyber resilient by the end of 2025? Because we're not that far away.
And to Vincent and Bella.
So as the NAA report again quite rightly points out, the scale of risk to government currently is extremely high, and that is a result of both the resilience levels that we see across government, so they are substantially lower than we had previously anticipated, but also the escalating threat environment. So the sum total of that is we are at critical risk at the moment. We have also set out targets in the government cybersecurity strategy for 2030. That is also a very ambitious target, but will be achievable if we are able to move further and faster to kind of tackle the scale of resilience challenges that we see.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to take a short break now. The clock stands at 16:32. If we could be back at sort of 16:40, just before we do formally break, just to say that microphones will be on, and so just you never know who. Just be careful what is said and who listens to it. I'm sure you are, naturally, in that respect. Order. Order, order. And we will now resume our session on cyber security. And we will turn to Chris Kane, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about GovAssure, but let me just set the scene for everyone else. So, paragraph 2.8 of the NA report, in April 2023, government security groups started agreeing with departments clear and risk-based cyber resilience outcomes that they needed to achieve. It did this by introducing an annual cyber security scheme known as GovAssure. And then paragraph 3.2, between April 23 and July 24, 35 government organisations took part in the first year. They self-assessed the cyber resilience of 72 IT systems that they considered to be critical to running their essential services. This is the bit that I'm going to get to. The GSG has not tried to establish how many critical IT systems there are across the government's digital estate, but it considers that the assessed systems will be a small proportion of these. So that's my sort of long-winded way of setting the scene to say, where are you in that assessment of the cyber security of the government's IT estate? Have you assessed it now? And can you assure us that the government really knows where it's vulnerable to attack?
So really happy to cover that, and then I might also pass to Joanna to talk in more detail about how we deal with legacy. So we have two primary mechanisms for understanding resilience of government IT systems. The first is GovAssure, which is our new cybersecurity assurance scheme for government, and that's focusing on the enduring technology estate, so the technology estate that will be with us for some time. We also then have the legacy IT register and the associated legacy risk framework, which then focuses on legacy systems and the risk that they pose. So if I focus specifically on GovAssure, GovAssure is a new initiative that as I've mentioned previously. So we launched that in April of 2023, and exactly as you described. So 35 government organisations took part in year one. And we had 72 critical systems assessed in that first year. We're now in year two, and we're covering a number of additional services as part of that, but we're still in the process of gathering that data. GovAssure is intended to be a rolling assurance process, so we will never be done with that process. The intent is that it gives us regular updates on resilience levels across government and gives us a kind of regular and in-depth picture of what those resilience levels look like. Now, it's absolutely right to say that the number of systems that we've assessed in year one is a small component of the total estate and even of the critical systems across government, but it is also designed to be representative. So each of those organisations that have been involved in the process have gone through a process of scoping with my team to understand which systems should be assessed in year one, and the intent behind that is to pick critical systems, so including critical national infrastructure, but also systems that are representative of those organisations and the services that they deliver. So whilst the results that we've gathered in year one are across a small number of systems, we are also able to infer a significant amount about the total resilience of government. It's also worth noting, and I'm happy to go into loads of detail on this, but I'll try and keep it brief. So we assess systems against the NCSC's cyber assessment framework, and whilst we do that at the system level, several of those controls actually give us a really good indication of how those organisations as a whole will operate. So we assess things like asset management, risk management and governance, as well as some of the more detailed system level controls. So GovAssure Year 1 has given us an understanding in detail of how resilient those individual systems are and how they're measuring against outcomes, but it has also given us an indication of the overall cyber resilience and health of the organisations that are taking part. We will get further information as we go through years 2, 3, etc. But the level of granularity and the objectivity of that data is already an enormous step forward for us and gives us a much better picture of what current resilience levels look like in practice. I'm happy to go into more detail on GovAssure, but also happy to hand to Joanna on the legacy framework, if that's useful.
Well, I'm sort of conscious we'll cover the legacy IT
Sure.
in a minute. So just sticking with GovAssure, because I mean it seems like a good idea. It seems like a good approach. But what I'm trying to work out is it is a good. If we assume for a minute it's a good approach from year one, it's going to be an excellent approach from year X. What is year X? When does it start to become? You've got a massive amount of data, you've got everything assured, you now know that this is a rolling programme that's working at full efficiency. And how are you going to increase that scale and pace to get there as quickly as you can?
So I should start by saying that the intent is not to assess every single system across government through that process. So GovAssure is and departments will absolutely tell you this is an intensive process. We do a lot of data gathering. The department is required to gather a lot of data and evidence against an individual system and answer a lot of supplementary questions about that system to enable us to assess it effectively. It would be disproportionate to do that across the entirety of the government estate or even across a big swathe of it. But it is important that we continue to assess critical systems and we get to kind of critical mass. I think what is most important for us is starting to build up a clear picture of where we see the most systemic challenges across government and how we identify the root causes of those. So success for GovAssure is not having assessed every single system across government. It's helping us to diagnose where the most significant issues are, what the kind of scale of resilience looks like in totality across government, and how we can take action from a central perspective to be able to tackle the scale of those resilience challenges. We're already getting that data. So we're already at a position where we are conducting root cause analysis right now on the challenges that we see at departmental level. We already know that asset management, risk management and response planning are particularly challenging areas that departments across government are struggling with. And we're already also targeting central activity on being able to tackle those risks, so those particular vulnerabilities. Response planning is a great example where actually there is low-hanging fruit there. So whilst we see that is a low level of maturity currently across departments, it's also a relatively easy thing to focus on and scale up. So that's one of our areas of focus, particularly as part of next financial year.
Could I just add two very quick things? So one, like all good assurance processes, it's important it's targeted to risk and is proportionate. So as Bella said, we're not trying to do 100% assurance, we're trying to target it on the most critical systems that we have in government. And I think that's right and is a normal approach to assurance. Secondly, the baseline for GovAssure will evolve. So in the same way that the threat is evolving, the standards that we expect to be testing government departments and critical infrastructure against will change. So the goalposts are going to keep moving. So it's quite a dynamic process. So I think to your very kind of top level question, we're never going to get 100% assessment, but we are going to keep raising the bar and to make sure that the areas that are of most risk to us are assessed on a regular basis.
Just to explore that a little further, if these are critical systems, what is the barrier to doing more? I absolutely will take the point that it's disproportionate if you're using all of the resources to do assurance, but if these are critical functions, is it an issue of resource? Would you do more if you had more resource?
I think that there are a number of kind of constraints to the process, and probably one of the most important ones is the level of resource that we have at departmental level, both focused on cybersecurity but also based and focused on service delivery. So the GovAssure process requires departmental teams to conduct quite a significant amount of assessment activity. If we focus the entirety of their efforts, of those kind of service delivery teams on that assurance activity, they are less able to conduct patching, they are less able to design updates to those services. I'm caricaturing, but it's a challenging balance for us to understand how much effort we need to focus on that really, really rigorous assurance process versus how much effort we allow teams to kind of focus on broader cybersecurity issues.
But I can understand if you took all of the government IT systems and said the following are critical and the rest are not critical. But what I think I'm hearing is that you're identifying what's critical, but you're not assuring yourself that all of the critical systems, which by then extension means that the non-critical systems are still important and still vulnerable but are not being assessed at all. So it's striking the balance between what the art of the possible and the art of the ideal. Again, is it resource? Is it if you get more digital specialists, if you had more money, you would do more? I'm trying to understand how you can have so much critical infrastructure that you're saying, well, we can't deal with that because we don't have the resource.
If I just take a step back of ashore and go back to what are accounting officers responsible for within their department. They are responsible for having the right controls and assurance over cyber risk. So if I take my own department, I'm not just using GovAssure as my only source of assurance. I have a very dedicated set of cyber and technical experts who are both preventing risk every single day. They're undertaking their own assessments, and I've got critical infrastructure within my own department. They are regularly doing their own work to assure themselves in what we would call the first line of defence in our assurance processes. What Bella's describing is the second line of defence, and what we're trying to do to consistently assure ourselves in the second line. So GovAssure is not the total control environment, nor should it be.
I'm sorry, just for a minute, if you would mind, Chair. I'm a little confused. So if you've got that level of assurance, if you're comfortable that you've got your responsible officers giving you that level of assurance, why do we need GovAssure on top of that?
Because this is about consistency, and any good control environment has 3 layers of defence, and every accounting officer has to take a view about what you want in each layer of defence. What we spotted a couple of years ago is that there wasn't a strong second line of defence, objectively and consistently assuring cyber risk for government. So what GovAssure is doing is providing that second line of assurance where there would have been a weakness previously. So, and sorry, I don't want to teach you about assurance overall.
I'm enjoying the lesson.
But what we're trying to do is to build up the layers of assurance proportionate to risk, and it's important that permanent secretaries take a view. But when it comes to the second line, we want consistency, we want to be able to share best practice, and that's what GovAssure is designed to do. You need first, second and third line, and the NEO is a really good example of third line. Independent, external, objective assurance, which also provides us with a layer of defence.
GovAssure is not going to ramp up in terms of the scale and pace. It's almost a fixed pace that you're comfortable with for what it does.
It's not quite right.
No, so I think it's absolutely right that we will. So as part of year 2, we're already assessing a larger number of systems than we did in year 1. So I think we've got around 100 assessments that have already been submitted to us across departments. So we are ramping up the number of systems that we're looking at. We are not doing that in an exponential fashion, but I think it's also worth noting that so with GovAssure we are driving the car and building it at the same time. So we launched it in April 23, following some early pilots with departments. It was still an early stage assurance process. There is much more that we can and need to do, particularly in terms of automation of that process, in terms of providing stronger support and guidance to departments in implementing it, and also in the root cause analysis to better understand the data that we are gathering from that process. So it is by no means a finished product, it is by no means a perfect product, but what it's already starting to do is give us the outcomes that we need in terms of understanding of resilience levels and understanding of where we can take action.
Thank you. I think we need to ramp up the pace a little bit. Sarah Olney, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my understanding of the role of GovAssure, Ms Powell, is when it came in April 2023, it replaced a system whereby departments were self-assessing their sort of cyber resilience. And my understanding from the report is that the assessments done by GovAssure showed that actually up till then, departments have been overestimating their readiness. Firstly, did that come as a shock? And secondly, what did you do in response to this kind of like increased awareness of the lack of resilience?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right in that characterisation. So previously, departments assessed their cybersecurity adherence to the government cybersecurity standard as part of the departmental security health check. So that was a self-assessed process. It was also against a prior standard, which required a much lower level of resilience. It was also much more prescriptive in terms of controls. What we've moved to with GovAssure is an outcome-based requirement that's set against the NCSC's cyber assessment framework. So I think it is absolutely right to say that we are holding departments to a higher and more appropriate standard of resilience, but also the levels of resilience that we see across government are also substantially lower than we had previously anticipated. So In the previous self-assessed returns, around a quarter of departments assessed that they were able to meet the cyber standard. We now know that kind of achievement of Governshore resilience levels is substantially lower than that across government organisations. And we can also see that there are particular areas where there are fundamental control failures across government organisations in asset management, risk management and response, as I called out earlier. What we've also seen is that there is a difference, and the NAA report also mentions this, between the initial self-assessment returns that departments conduct in the Governshore process and then the independent third-party assessment that's conducted afterwards. So even throughout the Governshore process, we're seeing the difference between a kind of self-assessment for an organisation and an independent assessment. What we've noticed is that where we have more mature organisations, where actually they're achieving a higher independently assessed score in Governshore, they are also better at self-assessing, whereas the less mature organisations have a more kind of substantial gap between their self-assessment and what comes back in the independent assessment. So the need for that independent assessment has also kind of been validated through the process. You're also right in saying that it has been quite challenging to kind of see the scale of resilience that we have actually achieved across governments. It is substantially lower than we had anticipated, and it means that we will need to take a fundamentally different approach in how we're tackling cyber resilience levels if we're to meet the 2030 targets, and that's something that we're doing.
Thank you. Mr. Devine, it seems the Governshore process was only introduced in April 2023, which seems quite late given how much we've known over the last decade about cyber risks. Why has it taken such a long time to bring it in?
It's a fair question. I'm tempted to say I arrived in January 2022.
Fair enough.
Look, I do think, if we're honest, we have probably woken up to the scale of the cyber risk more slowly than we should have. I think we've been very honest. I think the report captures that well. I think we were probably unrealistic in relying upon self-assessment in the minimum cybersecurity standards. I was actually pondering when you asked, were we surprised at the difference between the results of previous self-assessment and the results of Governshore, and tried to genuinely remember. I think we expected some difference, but we probably didn't expect the scale of difference that we saw, and we didn't expect the difference between self-assessment against CAF and the independent assessment to be so great. So I think it goes back, I mean, the short answer to your question is quite a long answer. It goes back to something that kind of rolls right throughout the report, that we probably didn't, despite, recognising this in 2010, starting to invest money significantly in 2016, we probably didn't ramp up the government response to cybersecurity from assurance through to response as quickly as we should have in retrospect. Why? Because I don't think we were alive to the threat as we should have been. We've already said it evolved more rapidly than we should have. And probably because we hadn't had the incidents that really brought it to life for us in the way we have over the last 5 years, either ourselves or our allies. It's not a good answer, but it's probably the true answer.
Do you think a sort of a mixture of naivety, perhaps, and I guess that lack of experience? I mean, that British Library example that you've used is very compelling, shall I say, but until something like that happened, you weren't aware of the threats. Is that perhaps a lack of intelligence from people who are monitoring these threats more broadly?
I mean, others will comment. I think there's something about prioritisation. There are a lot of demands in government departments. There have been a lot of demands over the last 10 years, and this is probably the question that we didn't prioritise cybersecurity sufficiently, and it wasn't brought alive to us by serious incidents the way it has been over recent years. But others might want to. That's very much a personal view.
I suppose and it's really difficult to go back in time to our predecessors, and I suppose, like all good risk management, you manage risks as best you can until they become an issue. When they become an issue and they're live and they're real, you step up your response. So I think there's definitely something about, we've always known about the risks, but it wasn't until it became a real live issue that the scale of what we were dealing with became clear, and it needs a different sort of response.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
We like candid answers in this committee, so congratulations both of you. My ever-patient deputy, Clive Betts.
Right, so a few more candid answers maybe. Govershore's a step forward. You've explained to us it's away from the self-assessment, except you've left behind out there in the self-assessment process departmental responsibility the worst systems, the legacy systems, the ones that where the risk is greatest, the threat's greatest, the security is least, but you're not dealing with them. Why?
Well, perhaps I could invite Joanna to set out what we're doing about legacy IT.
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, there is a significant amount of legacy IT in the public sector estate. We know that because we've recently done a lot of research on that and produced our State of Digital Government report, which has shown that about 28% of our IT estate is classed as legacy across the whole of the public sector. And it's true that historically we didn't have a lot of information about, in the centre, about our legacy technology and the risk that we carried. So about 2 years ago we introduced the Legacy IT Risk Framework, which is a framework that we have been working with departments to implement. So this is really focused on central government departments and major agencies that have big IT estates. And that's to look at their legacy systems and to classify them, or to understand which of them, from the perspective of the likelihood of an issue happening and the impact of that issue, which of them are red rated, so the most risky of the systems. And this isn't just about cyber, this is also about their operational risk, just from technical failure, or their utility in terms of actually being able to meet department objectives, their ability to actually deliver the service that departments need. So it's not just about cyber. What we know from the work that we've done so far is that as of January, and these numbers are an update actually on the ones that are in the NEO report, we'd assessed 319 legacy IT assets, and almost a quarter of those were red rated. So again, as with GovAssure, as we have gone through this process, we have understood that we have quite a significant challenge out there in departments. We're continuing to look at that framework, and we're looking at how do we. We're looking at work now to expand that and to make it more consistent across all of government, and also to align it better with GovAssure, so that we've got a complete picture across both the legacy and the non-legacy estate.
Well, there's one or two more questions. So 319 have been assessed by yourselves or by departments themselves?
No, it's a joint effort between ourselves and departments. So it's a set of questions that they answer, and we review that. We do some assurance on it, but you're right in that it is a self-assessment rather than a fully assured in the way that GovAssure is.
Right, so it's a halfway house approach.
Yeah, at the moment it is, yes.
At the moment. Right, okay, well, there's two further questions from that. 319 systems assessed. How many are there to be assessed?
So the really honest answer is we don't know. And the reason I'm saying that is that when we did our State of Digital Government review, there were about 15% of the organisations we spoke to who didn't know what their legacy was. They couldn't give us a view of it. So there is a challenge in terms of the organisations who are responsible for legacy don't necessarily, in all cases, know themselves what the risk is in their estate. And that was the whole purpose of creating this risk assessment framework, was to shine a light on that and to start to get information that enables us to challenge departments to do the work to understand that.
Not knowing what the risk is one thing, but not knowing what the systems are, that are legacy systems, is another.
I think that they know their systems, but whether they've been assessed in terms of the level of risk that's carried from the perspective of, do they qualify as legacy, and what's the risk is the thing that they don't necessarily understand.
Right. Do we know how many systems there are, whatever you call them, which have not yet been assessed? We don't
have that data.
Do departments have the data?
There's a real difference in the level of maturity in departments in terms of their understanding of their legacy assets, and there's also quite a difference in terms of each organisation in terms of the number that they've got. So the research that we did showed that departments, it varies between about 10 and 60% of the estate in departments is classified as legacy. So some are understand their estates very well and actually have relatively low levels of legacy, whereas others have much higher quantities. So,
yeah, but we'll come back to the question: how many systems are there? And that's back to the question again about how many are there that still need to be assessed. Should the departments know how many systems there are?
Not always. It depends how. That information isn't necessarily collated centrally in a way that's it's easy to access.
Just to expand on this, so we have, as we've discussed in this group several times, a large number of arm's length bodies and public bodies, and so when we say departmental families, departments have a very good grip on their external service-facing systems. They have a very good grip on what is close to them. Yeah. What I think is less gripped is where we've got arm's length bodies, where we're reliant on 2-3 layers down the departmental chain, what their understanding is and how they've assessed their IT. And as Joanna, I think, was about to go on to say, like, this is one of the challenges to sharing data in government, is you're constantly relying on layers of information being fed up back to us centrally so that we can take a view overall. So I completely share your concern. That gap is not acceptable.
Well, should the departments just be required to drop a list for a central register of what systems there are? I mean, all right, there are arm's length bodies and others which are ultimately accountable to departments, but surely they ought to know if they're asked the question, didn't they?
So each department will have a view on that, not necessarily consistent. So they may not hold the data in the same formats. They won't necessarily have the same systems to actually asset management systems to enable them to quickly extract reports to give us the information in a format that we can then process. So we need to fix that. I absolutely agree that we need to fix that. And one of the core things that we're doing through, for example, our Secure by Design approach is making sure that we've got the right kind of information, that metadata around what's contained within the estate, so that we can fix forward on that.
So what is your timetable to do that? Have you got deadlines for department to respond to this, I think, quite important question?
So it's part of a process. It's part of an ongoing process in terms of how we work with departments to understand what they've got in terms of their IT estates.
Mate, this is quite a critical issue. This about the threat from potential attack, cyber attack that could be launched against a legacy system, and we don't yet know what the systems are to begin with. So shouldn't there at least be a deadline for departments to say, this is the list of systems we have, and then you can look at how long it's going to take to work through and do an assurance process on them?
So we're continuing to expand the number of systems that we're looking at, working with departments. So we are improving that information as we go. But I think it's not as simple as sort of saying what's the list, because
we're lay people here. We're just asking questions about what seems an obvious issue. If you need to know what the problems are, you begin by saying what are the systems we might have problems with.
So we've asked that question of departments, and we've had responses through our legacy risk framework. So we've got that understanding, and we are continuing to expand that out to other organisations. It's not a resource-free exercise. It's a little bit like with the GovSure.
Right, come on, we might get back to the issue then. Haven't you got the resources to enable you to push departments to give you this information, or is it departments haven't got the resources to actually assess what they've actually got in terms of systems?
It's a bit of both. So we within the centre are expanding our capacity to be able to work with departments to understand better what they've got and what their risks are, and departments are putting more effort into sort of understanding their estates and putting the systems in place to enable them to better understand their estates. I think it's a little bit like where we got to with GovSure. There's a balance between how much resource do we put into measuring things in order to understand risk at the individual asset level versus have we got enough information to understand that we've got a problem, and now do we start to triage what do we do about it? And I think we're more into that, how from the centre can we put the right mechanisms in place now that we understand the issue, that we understand there is an issue out there, to start to help remediate it. Because ultimately what we need to do is remediate this problem, fix it. It's less about more and more measurement and more about how do we get the right mechanisms in place to put accountability in place to fix it.
Right, but you've got to know what systems you're going to fix before you start fixing them.
And that was, if you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything. We are actually now moving forward in terms of understanding enough about what the risk is to be able to then start to put in place mechanisms to sort it out.
And you said it wasn't just probably lack of resources you've got, or not enough resources to do everything, but departments as well haven't got the resources, but they haven't yet. So departments should have fully funded plans, shouldn't they, to fix their legacy?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about legacy is it's often the visibility of it isn't always in the department, because often it's IT that has been developed and is being maintained and operated by third parties, and so it's a very complex information chain in order to be able to extract that information about the estate. And systems are not necessarily single things. They're quite complex sets of components. So you might have one part of a system that's a problem and other parts that are not. So actually trying to work your way through this and understand all of that complexity when it's the data is actually not in the department or in the agency, it's actually in a third party, is part of why we have a challenge.
Don't worry there, you've got some very high-risk systems that haven't been properly assessed, or you don't even know they're there. But whether data sharing is something that's been encouraged in government, and if you're data sharing from a system which is, shall we say, has low protection with other systems, then you can surely pass problems across to other parts of the IT world in government.
So I think that's probably less of a risk, in that a lot of these legacy systems tend to be isolated. They're not networked in the way in the way you might think of a modern system. So they tend to be sitting in towers in third party data centres. So if that's your question around, yeah. I mean, the other thing that I would say about legacy is not all legacy is necessarily a problem. We've of the legacy that we've assessed, yes, getting on for a quarter of it we have assessed as being red rated. There's a large proportion of legacy that's not flashing red in terms of being a technical resilience or a cyber risk. It's not good because it's expensive to operate, and it's not necessarily delivering what we need in terms of the quality of service. But it's not at this point an issue.
Let's come back on to funding issues. If no one knows what actually the problems are out there, and what the systems are that might be problematic, how can departments put in proper bids to the spending review? And when they do, how can we be certain that they actually spend them on the issues that are challenging or a problem? Because in the past, apparently, some money allocated for cyber-related issues have suddenly been spent on other things that become a different priority for departments.
I mean, what this part of our discussion really brings to light is that government in a period of scarce resources has got to make prioritised decisions based on risks and how much assurance is desired. And it's for the government to set its risk appetite and to use that risk appetite and information to therefore allocate resources accordingly. And just to be really, really clear, it's not as if we have a 100% lack of sight. As Joanna said, we've made huge progress in understanding the most significant issues that we've got. And whilst it's not every single system, it is the vast majority. So in the spending review, what we're doing differently to last time is, firstly, we're running a zero-based review for technology, which is currently underway, to understand how every single pound of spending is undertaken across the system. That's the first time we've done a zero-based review on technology, how it's spent, where the money's going. That will help us to answer some of the questions about where the money's going and what it's buying from a systems perspective. I think the second thing that we're doing is we're using both GovAssure and our technical expertise on legacy IT to set out for ministers the choices about risk and how much risk you want to buy out. I mean, that is the fundamental question, is if you've got X billion pounds available to fund people, resources, skills, to remediate legacy IT, to invest in new technology, how you use your allocative resource has got to be risk-based and it's got to be outcome-based. And the whole point of the spending review process is to bring outcomes and risks together so that ministers can make a funding allocation choice. Experts in DCIT and in our cyber teams are embedded into the Treasury process, so the Treasury is very, very reliant on our brilliant central experts to help advise ministers to make those choices. And that work is very, very live. You made one point earlier, you talked about surely there are fully funded plans out there. That is not the case. You always have to make choices about how much funding you put in to buy new things, to manage the legacy systems and the risks that you've got, and to build up skills. And I don't think I've ever seen a situation where we have fully funded to the 100% possibility all of those things. That is an allocative choice.
So you talk about priorities and level of risk you're prepared to accept, and the government has got to come up with a sum of money to remediate these legacy systems. But if you don't know what precisely is out there, how do you know where to make those priorities and risks? And we're coming to the year end of departments now. Would it not be reasonable to ask them at the end of their 2 months from their year end, all of their departmental systems, all of their next steps, ALBs, all of them, to give you a list of where the legacy systems are? Because the legacy systems are not, just as we discussed, an entry point for cyber. As the British Library makes very clear, if you get a legacy system which is not supported hacked, it's very much more difficult to remediate it afterwards. So this is a real priority, isn't it?
It is. It's a huge priority, and I don't want the committee in any way to think that this isn't one of our biggest priorities in government. It has to be, because of all of the opportunities and the risks that we've discussed in several committees now. So it is a huge priority. I think that the choice about does central government, and by the centre of government I mean DCIT and the Cabinet Office, do we spend all of our time trying to get 100% complete data, or do we need to get the balance on doing as much as we can and then relying on departments? I think that is a choice. What we're choosing to do is to say we'll get 80-90% there, but we really need departments to own the risk, to tell us where there are gaps, to make sure that accounting officers have got the support to set out the risks, to bid into the SR process and to come to us for help. That is a partnership, and it has always been thus and will always be to some extent that way. But in the SR, it is my absolute hope that we are able to do a much better job than we have done previously in elucidating those risks, having a proper conversation about prioritisation and buying out as much risk as we can afford.
We'll move on, but I suspect the laggards will always be laggards unless they're some way pushed to do something about it.
And I, again, would not want you to think there is not a lot of push. There is a huge amount of pushing from Joanna and her teams, and from the Cabinet Office and the Treasury.
Thank you very much. Luke Charteris, please.
Just to reiterate what we heard, it's just really disappointing that you don't seem to have a grip on where the legacy systems are across the arm's length bodies. I mean, these are not inconsequential organisations. It's arms bodies like the National Crime Agency, CQC, CPS, Nuclear Decommissioning Authority.
Yeah, and
so would you, just if I may, would you set out to the committee, perhaps at the chair's advice, where there are gaps, who's not responded, and perhaps your view on whether there should be a better process for actually requisitioning this information?
We can do that, and just reassuring of the organisations, the 29 organisations that we have worked with to date on the legacy risk framework, some of those are arm's length bodies, and we have targeted the ones that have the bigger IT estates. So we are conscious that we need to prioritise in that direction. But we can write with that information in terms of.
And apologies, I just wanted to clarify. It's not that we haven't worked with all arm's length bodies. It's just the complex supply chain arrangements and the fact that you have got lots of different layers of accountability means it's just harder to get right down into the depth of understanding of systems. That I was just explaining the challenges. So we definitely have got lots of public bodies that we have worked with.
Thank you very much. Lauren Edwards, please.
Just a question, if I may, off the final discussion. Obviously, the legacy systems are quite an important gap. How are you managing supply chain risk, though, across Whitehall? Because that would seem to be another vulnerability.
Can I just comment first? Going back to Mr. Charter's question earlier about Synovus, I mean, that's a classic example of a risk that's in an ALB, in a supply chain. That's two of our most difficult areas to manage. We are doing a great deal, Bill, if you're happy to speak, we are doing a great deal to try and improve our management of security in the supply chain, because we are aware it's a vulnerability at the moment.
Yeah, really happy to go into more detail. So you're absolutely right. Supply chain security is a really, really complex area for us, particularly given the incidents that we've seen, ransomware incidents and others impacting supply chains, and then the direct impact that has on public services. We've taken a number of actions to date to improve how we manage security particularly for our critical suppliers. So that includes defining modular security schedules that can be included in contracts for government organisations to ensure that they are asking for the right things of their suppliers from a security perspective. And we also work very, very closely with particularly strategic suppliers to government to ensure that we have a very open and partnering relationship with them, that in the event of an incident, information is free-flowing and that it's a positive relationship, but also that we are holding them to the highest standards from an assurance perspective. We can absolutely do more in that space, though. So one of the things that we're going to be focusing on in the next financial year, and as part of taking a much more interventionist approach to cyber resilience, is ensuring that we have stronger supply chain assurance in place, and also making sure that we are working in a much more targeted way with strategic suppliers to hold them to account, but also to agree really, really clear objectives for how they can help government to improve cyber resilience levels, how they can use their understanding of delivery across government to identify critical gaps, and fundamentally how they can help us to transform. The strategic partnership agreement with Microsoft is a really great example of how that process will work. So as part of that, we've defined very clear security objectives that we'll be working in partnership with Microsoft on, and the sort of the intent is that we use that as a forcing factor to improve resilience across government organisations, but also use the sort of the collective expertise of that organisation to help us to drive up standards. And I don't know if Joanna might want to say anything on sort of broader strategic partner relationships from a security perspective as well.
No, just that Microsoft deal is a model that we want to try and roll out across our major suppliers, and as we roll out our secure by design approach, just thinking about the supply chain and ensuring that the technology partners we use have the right controls in place is a core part of, it's one of the key principles in that framework.
That's really comforting. Is it the case then that all tendering or procurement requires a robust cyber defence from the supply chain partner?
Yes, so the security schedules that we have set out, we have different schedules that are relevant to different types of contract, but departments are advised to use those as part of the contracting process to ensure that they have appropriate standards in place. Again, there is more that we can do in that space, and we can ensure that they are applied more appropriately. We can give more support to departments in the application, but that is absolutely the intent. There is a really clear set of requirements in place for future contracts. It's worth noting that those modular security schedules are not in place for pre-existing contracts, so it is very much a process of fixing forward, and we also have a responsibility to help departments manage the risk with their existing suppliers, but that has been a really positive step for us.
I'm just getting back to the NAO report. Paragraph 2.12 talks about the government security group and departments lacking the time and resources to improve cyber resilience outcomes following the conclusion of the first year of GovAssure in July last year. And it mentions that in November last year, GSG had not commissioned progress updates from departments, but planned to do so once departments had more opportunity to implement their targeted improvement plans. A question really for Bella. What is your assessment that these departments can and will implement their GovAssure improvement plans in light of this?
So to clarify the process, so we go through the assessment process for individual systems, and then we collectively agree a targeted improvement plan per system with each department. At the time the report was written, we hadn't commissioned updates because we would fully expect that it would take 6 to 12 months as a minimum for departments to be able to achieve a sort of realistic change, particularly when we're talking about fundamental controls like asset management, risk management, etc. I would absolutely say that the use of targeted improvement plans is a really important step forward to us. We have asked departments to really focus on those targeted improvement plans as part of their engagement on the spending review to ensure that they are prioritising response to the vulnerabilities that have been identified in those reports, and that they are ensuring that is a core part of their bids. Obviously, in many instances, response to those targeted improvement plans will be dependent on decisions made in the spending review, but we have made it very clear to departments that is the expectation, that delivery of those plans is absolutely critical as part of achieving the outcomes that we set out for them. We are also taking steps to really strengthen the accountability frameworks we have in place for government organisations. So use of GovAssure results at the most senior levels of government is something that we think is really critical to ensure that departments are prioritising investment in targeted improvement plans and improving response. We now report on GovAssure results to the Civil Service Board, as was now heads of department. And we are also intending to strengthen that framework further. So the blueprint for modern digital government sets out a commitment to changing our relationship with technology risk in the round and ensuring that there is really clear accountability at PermSec level and downwards to understand and then also respond to technology risks, including cyber risks. So that's something that we'll also be working on.
Thank you. So would you say that you're confident that they will be implemented then at this stage, admittedly early stage?
I'm confident that they will be prioritised. I think implementation will be subject to available funding and decisions in the spending review.
Resource contingent. Okay. Thank you, that's helpful. One of the gaps for me was CBEST testing, which I know a little bit from my time at the Bank of England, doing cyber penetration testing with some of the very large financial companies that operate in the UK. It's obviously a kind of gold standard system that allows companies to sort of invite teams in to come and test their cyber defences and to be able to sort of have that real life example and then obviously learn from any access that is given and anything that comes off the back of that. It's not mentioned in the NAA report, but I do understand that the government, in light of that, has created back in 2018, I think, a similar system called GBEST that's been running annually since 2018. So I really welcome that external testing of Whitehall's defences. I think that's really important and supplements a lot of the important work that we've been discussing today. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about that process. Admittedly, you can't go into too much detail, but what can you tell us about that GBEST process and how it interacts with some of the other things that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, really happy to. So the Government Security Red Team sits as part of my team in the Cyber Directorate in Cabinet Office. We conduct a series of, a rolling exercise of GBEST, GCASE, which is a sort of slimmed down version of a similar exercise from a cyber perspective, and also physical security red teaming exercises on government departments. That is a core part of our assurance process. So the work that we do there is essentially we speak to individual departments, we have a rolling programme, and we sort of focus the programme on departments who either have critical infrastructure, who have not been tested for some time, have had particular challenges. And we go through the process with them of scoping a red teaming exercise, conducting it, assessing the outcomes and agreeing actions that they need to take as a result of that. We do two things with that. So one is that we ensure the department is using that information as powerfully as possible. So what we find is that it's incredibly helpful to use some real life examples of how systems can be compromised with the board of a department, so that they really feel the pain of quite how vulnerable a particular organisation or a particular system is. And we also use that for tabletop exercising, which is a really, really kind of powerful mechanism to help boards understand scale of threat and also vulnerability. What we also do is use that data as an input to our broader assurance process. So we look at all of the GBEST and GCASE activities that we've conducted across governments, and we identify systemic vulnerabilities or systemic kind of issues with controls, which we also kind of look at in comparison with our GovAssure results. So it's a really important part of our cross-government assurance approach, but we also make sure we get best bang for buck in kind of using the outcome of those individual assessments with departments to help them to understand the scale of the problem. And they're great for business cases as well. So it's really great if you can say, and we have an exercise that proves that we have these vulnerabilities and this is what would happen if an incident occurs.
That's helpful. And so it sounds like the outcomes of those tests are then shared throughout Whitehall so that lessons can be learned. Is that the case?
So the outcomes of the individual tests are not shared, so they tend to stay with the individual department. Often there is very sensitive information included there about individual systems, individual kind of components of the organisation. So that stays with the organisation unless they agree with us that we can use it as part of a case study. But the anonymised results and the systemic issues and vulnerabilities that we identify are then shared as part of our wider assurance process with government departments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Chris Kane, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask about the move to make the public sector resilient by 2030? Talk about that for a minute. I think the committee notes and the annual report notes that government security group's got the implementation plan for what it's going to do, but what there isn't is the strategy and implementation plan that sets out what everybody else is going to do and who needs to do what and when they're going to do it. So how can everyone become 2030 if that full plan isn't in place?
I want to take that one.
No, I'm really happy to. Okay. So I think, as I've mentioned previously, so the 2030 target is intentionally ambitious and will be enormously challenging to achieve. We should be really, really clear about that. But what it also does is set a very clear target for government departments, for their arm's length bodies and for the wider public sector to achieve. And I think, it's really important to recognise that in the government cybersecurity strategy, we set a clear expectation for lead government departments in particular to understand and to tackle the scale of risk for their core department, for their arm's length bodies and for the public sectors within their purview. So the responsibility for that broader public sector lies with lead government departments. We have seen a varying response to the strategy to date, but I think it's fair to say we've seen some really, really positive steps taken in, for example, Department for Health and Social Care have set out a very clear cybersecurity strategy for health and social care, which links directly to the government cybersecurity strategy. They have strengthened their assurance processes. They have put in place really clear policies for broader public sector organisations within health and social care to respond to. They have invested in common infrastructure and common services where that's appropriate. And they have seen kind of commensurate positive steps in the sort of overarching resilience of the health and social care sector. Actually, the approach that they have taken is one that we are kind of very much looking at from the centre when we think about how we can drive change more effectively and how we can achieve a step change in our approach. We would absolutely categorise the approach they've taken as much more interventionist and much more focusing on what can be delivered from a central organisation in order to enact change. So actually, we'd see that that model as a particular case study where there has been really positive change made. But it's absolutely right to say that the public sector is large and complex, and if we want to achieve the 2030 targets, we are going to need to take a fundamentally different approach. One of the things that we're looking at, particularly as part of the next financial year and as recognised by the NAO, is how we can change the systems of delivery across government from a cyber perspective, how we can define a new target operating model that allows us to be much more interventionist from the centre where that's appropriate. We're in the process of designing that model at the moment, and we're piloting some services this financial year to help us to deliver an early benefit and de-risk that model. Where we see particular value is in strengthening accountability, making sure lead government departments and organisations across government have a really clear set of requirements that they're working to and that we are measuring them against that, but also looking at delivery of services at scale. So where are there examples where we can deliver a service once and well from the centre that allows us to make a material difference to the resilience of public sector organisations in the round. An example that we're piloting this financial year is cross-government vulnerability scanning. So that's being delivered by colleagues over in the Government Digital Service. And that is a really great example of a digital service that helps us to better understand the internet-facing vulnerabilities of a really, really broad range of organisations to give us not only a better understanding of scale of risk and attack surface across government, but also to then help those organisations to respond better. So it's a model that we think will be very powerful to us in helping to kind of drive that broader public sector change, but it's going to be really challenging to deliver.
When we talk about the public sector, we are a United Kingdom, we've got devolved nations, but the cyber threat does not recognise our own internal borders. So how are you working across the devolved nations to try and get this 2030 target? Does it include that? Is there good cooperation on this? Is there good cross-working?
So we work really, really closely with the devolved administrations, and there are a number of initiatives that we've delivered centrally, which they have also. So we have particular examples where they've voluntarily adopted. So Governshore is a great example where we've got really, really strong uptake from devolved administrations, and I think what we see there is that there is a real opportunity for strong collaboration and for setting out a set of central initiatives, kind of doing some heavy lifting that can then be really, really powerful. So yes, it's been a positive process so far.
And I suppose there's always learning that you can get from the devolved nations as well as they can get from the UK government. As a Scottish MP, I'm very used to robust and ambitious targets being put in place and they're just not met. So in terms of the 2030 target, there is good evidence of what happens when government departments put in place these targets that are so ambitious they're just never going to be met. Are you learning these lessons as well about being realistic but also being robust with what you're doing? And I think I would sort of bring that back to the strategy implementation plan. You're being realistic, you're being robust, and are you learning from other parts of the United Kingdom where sometimes that ambition just means a reset is on the cards in 2 or 3 years, and it's a never-ending cycle of resets rather than delivery?
It's really going back to your earlier question, capturing that too. Just to be clear, we fully agree the recommendation report that we need a cross-government implementation plan to meet our 2030 targets, which will capture both what Bella's team proposes to do, but also what departments have committed to do, and we'll develop that plan once we see the outcome of the spending review. But I think the report also emphasised that we need to put in place a much stronger monitoring and evaluation framework, and I know Bella's team are already working on that. So we absolutely have learned the lessons of setting targets and allowing people to move towards them at their own pace without understanding what they're doing. So we will have a cross-government implementation plan within 6 months, and we will have a robust monitoring and evaluation framework to support that. So hopefully we won't fall into the trap you've talked about.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much, Chris. Claire Betts, please.
How can you be sure that you're focusing on the right issues when you haven't got full information about what's actually going on out there in departments and arm's length bodies?
So if I kind of go back to the sort of the engagement that we have with departments. So we work very closely with departments to understand, not only current resilience levels, but also the challenges that they're facing on a day-to-day basis. We include them in governance for delivery of the government's cybersecurity strategy, and we work really closely with their teams. I think it is really important to note, though, that the work that we have focused on from a central perspective, so Governshore, the Government Cyber Coordination Centre, has been really, really focused on helping us to better measure and better understand the scale of risks that we see across government organisations, the challenges that we see at departmental level, and how we can tackle those. Our focus on those central initiatives has been at the expense of defining and rolling out and coordinating a cross-government implementation plan that directly challenges departments to deliver on their outcomes. But I would say it's absolutely the case that we have been collaborating extremely closely with departments and have also put in place measures to allow us to understand the types of challenges that they're dealing with.
So the cross-government implementation plan is going to be in place when?
So NAO have included that as part of their recommendations, which we've absolutely accepted. Work is underway already to define that cross-government implementation plan, and I will double check and write back to you. But I think we've committed to publishing that in summer 2025.
Yeah. It needs to go alongside the spending review for obvious reasons. So we need to set out what we would ideally do so that government can take choices, and then we can set out a fully funded plan that's going to work.
And how far will this extend, to the wider government, if you like, to local authorities, to parts of the health service, given hospital trusts are separate bodies with their own ways of developing and buying IT systems?
So the government cybersecurity strategy covers government and public sector, as do those targets, and the implementation plan will also be scoped to do exactly that. Clearly, there will be a difference between how we set out requirements for central government organisations and then how we support lead government departments in implementation of those targets within their sectors, but the scope will be the entirety of the public sector.
Okay, I think that might come on to another question about the powers that you might have over wider the government, but I think that's a helpful initial answer. Thank you.
Luke Charteris, please.
Thank you. I was going to ask around sort of what changes at the central government would help departments with your leadership. But I think we've actually had some quite clear answers there. Can I just perhaps just cycle back to arm's length bodies and just ask how specifically you are supporting their cyber resilience position from your position at the centre?
So just at very high level, I mean, everything that we are doing for central government applies to our arm's length bodies. It is a bit of a cascade because, we issue direction at top level. The departmental permanent secretary and senior leadership team are responsible for cascading that through the arm's length bodies that they sponsor and are responsible for. But everything we do should equally apply to arm's length bodies and to public bodies at large.
And then, just finally, is that cascade effective?
I think it's going to be inconsistent just by the nature of the different issues and the different risks that we're dealing with. Part of why we have GovAssure and the work we're doing on legacy IT is to help assure us on how consistently all parts of government are responding to what we've asked them to do. And as I said earlier, there's always a balance between how much checking, how much policing you do, and how much you have to place accountability into departmental hands, so that everyone wants the centre to do more, and I'm a great believer that you have got to have empowered, accountable people close to the front line who can take proportionate decisions.
Thank you very much, Luke Charteris. Probably a question for you, Mr. Devine. Are there any countries out there in the world that do cyber prevention better than us, from whom we can learn lessons?
I think there probably are. I'm going to ask Bella because our team's been out speaking to some of them. It is worth noting that, not in defence of where we are, but just as a matter of fact, most of our partners are facing the same challenges. So they're all playing catch up with the threat, they're all playing catch up with a risk that's beyond their appetite. I think there are some countries, of the big countries we work with, I think the report calls out the Australians. I'm happy to do that in the record. In any case, the Australians have put in place a number of interventions.
It does. Paragraph 2.23.
So I'm more than happy to put that. I think some countries who face a particularly challenging cyber risk, some of our Baltic partners, if you look at the Estonians, for example, I think they have learned a lot over recent years that they've put into their systems. We speak to our Ukrainian counterparts. In fact, we're very lucky to have our Ukrainian counterpart come across to our conference the last 2 years. They're in a particularly challenging environment. One of the advantages of that, and there aren't many advantages, they learn very quickly. They're evolving very quickly. So I think there are a number of partners we can learn from. Australia is the model. I think we see great similarities and we want to learn the most from it. Bella, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that characterisation. So whilst there are a number of international governments where we can learn an enormous amount, particularly those who are much more focused on digital adoption and have achieved a much greater rate of digital service adoption and kind of public sector digitisation, our Five Eyes partners in particular are kind of demonstrating a really effective way of dealing with cyber resilience challenges. Vincent's already mentioned Australia. Canada similarly has a really helpful approach that we're drawing on as part of the work that we're doing to reset our model for government cyber resilience and define our new target operating model. And similarly, the US and New Zealand have some really, really helpful steps that we are drawing from. One of the things that we see, actually two of the things that we see which are particularly powerful, particularly for Canada and Australia. The first is a real focus on transparency and kind of clear assurance of resilience levels across government organisations. So our Australian counterparts in particular publish on a regular basis the sort of the resilience levels that they see across government organisations, and they found that has been really, really helpful in kind of driving accountability across government organisations. But also what we see in Canada, Australia and in other countries is that delivery of so a much more interventionist approach, but particularly taking on responsibility for delivery of cyber services at scale where it makes sense to do so from the centre has been enormously powerful. Our colleagues in Canada in particular have taken really, really helpful steps in sort of thinking about where they can deliver central capabilities and central services that has an enormously powerful effect in helping them to understand the scale of risk that they see across government and also helping them to respond more effectively to threats when they arise. So we are absolutely looking to them as kind of models of approach, and we're learning lessons from them as part of our more interventionist approach for cyber resilience.
Let's just take part of that answer, if I may. We're a great believer in this committee on openness and transparency. Could we not follow the Australian model and publish a lot more of departments' resilience so that we can see where the best exemplars are?
I think it's, so firstly, the State of Digital Government report that's recently been released by colleagues in DCIT, I think is a fantastic step forward in kind of creating a real level of transparency around the scale of challenges that we see across our digital estate, particularly in legacy and in terms of the GovAssure results that we are seeing. There is absolutely more that we could do in that space. It is a challenging balance between ensuring that we're creating that transparency and also ensuring that we're not creating avenues for malicious actors to take further action against government. But absolutely, that's something that we can explore further.
Yeah, and ultimately that is a choice for the government to make, given the very serious risks that you've got to balance those choices against. But I think we would generally err with you that transparency is a very good thing.
All right, these are sort of a bit random questions. I'm just sort of sweeping up, really. Paragraph 2.18, the Government Security Centre, GSEC, which GSCG funds, has needed to initiate contact with departments to raise awareness of its free cyber security consultancy services. This is not because there is not a centrally coordinated way of communicating GSEC's offer to departments to ensure that they seek it out when they need it. This could limit departments' take-up of these services. I mean, I don't know anything about them, but it sounds that's an amazing offer. Could you not do more to promulgate that?
So we absolutely can. We work really closely with the Cyber GSEC, so that's hosted in HMRC. We work very closely with them as an organisation to ensure that we are making best use of the resources that they have available, and also that we are matching them to departments that have particular challenges. One of the services that we've been piloting this financial year as part of our more interventionist approach is something called deployed cyber enablement teams. This is something that we have learned about from our Five Eyes partners, and essentially what that's doing is deploying technical teams into departments to tackle vulnerabilities where they may not have the skills or expertise to deliver on them, or they just don't have the resources. The Cyber GSEC is going to be helping us to deliver that next financial year. So I think one of the things that we need to do much more effectively is provide a really, really clear strategy for how we can best use those resources. But absolutely, that's something that we're planning on.
A couple of technical questions. I'm not a technical expert. I hasten to add before I ask these questions, but I need to ask them because we've been given evidence about them. And the first one is from a Nigel D. Crook. And he says the issue with such a monoculture, this is the government using exclusively Microsoft software, the issue with monoculture, and this goes against what I would always have thought on wearing my procurement hat, is that a virus infection or software configuration issue at the servers quickly cascades across the monoculture with resulting failure of the majority user devices while individual desktop laptops are reconfigured and manually rebooted. Of course, this is what happened in the CrowdStrike episode last year. As a procurement person, one would want to get best value for money, and best value for money probably inevitably means Microsoft. But obviously there's the opposite case out there to deal with this sort of monoculture situation.
Just a couple of things before I'm sure others will want to add to this from a technical, and I'm not a technical expert either. But what we're trying to do is weigh up the benefits of having large suppliers at scale, which include also interoperability as well as value for money. As a department that's not on a Microsoft platform, I can tell you it is incredibly frustrating to have to constantly say, I'm very sorry, I can't send you that document to work on because my system doesn't talk to your system. So we need to think about how we create the best environment for our staff to operate in and drive value for money. And that has to be weighed up against the obvious risks that come with these large primes delivering quite a lot of our services. A lot of where we are is historic. It's not as though it's been by design. So what we're trying to do is to maximise the economy of scale, maximise value for money, ensure that we're working with our supply chain to manage risk effectively, and to increase interoperability at the same time. That is not straightforward.
Does anybody want to add to that?
Well, just to add to that, I mean, the CrowdStrike that showed that. I mean, it's not just about cyber. CrowdStrike was not a cyber incident. That was a technical failure, and one of the things that it exposed is that actually we didn't have a national focus for just technical resilience issues rather than cyber issues. It's very clear if it's cyber issues to NCSC. It was less clear for a technical resilience issue. We fixed CrowdStrike, but one of the outcomes of that is that we have now identified the accountabilities within government for dealing with those sorts of technical failures in future, and it sits within DCIT, within the Government Digital Service.
Very important. So then we've had some evidence from an organisation called the Open Cloud Coalition, and they talk about the dominant cloud platforms, which they say 60% of the UK government and public IT systems operate on cloud services, of which 80% of these rely on just two providers. They then go on to say if one of these providers accounts for 50% of UK government services in a single region, a failure or outage could then take down 30% of the public sector, highlighting the critical need for diversification and resilience. And they particularly talk about the Cabinet Office's 2017 shift from cloud first to public cloud first. It comes back to what you were saying, Kat, about this dominance of certain players, but on the other hand, the need to communicate between the different systems.
Yeah,
How are you going to deal with those two competing issues?
I think the first thing to say is there's not just a government challenge. There are a small number of dominated cloud services out there. There isn't a huge competitive market with lots of different providers there. So, we're not market shaping in our scale. So that is what the market has to offer us. And secondly, quite a lot of our legacy systems are operating off a very small number of cloud providers. And until you fix some of the legacy issues, it's very difficult to move off some of the cloud services that are there. But Joanna's the expert.
Yeah, I think you said, I mean, that it is a market that has a small number of suppliers. We are quite concentrated on those suppliers, as is everybody. We are looking at how do we ensure that issue around regional risk, that we actually work with our suppliers to ensure that we don't have too much of a concentration within a particular regional area. We're going to have to keep that constantly under review. The positive thing, though, about cloud services and actually all the subscription-based services, which is where we're moving to in terms of all of our new digital development, is that it does build in continuous improvement, continuous maintenance, it reduces the risk of developing new legacy. And so that's why these things are all a balance, but moving more into subscription-based services like cloud actually helps us to manage the legacy risk. And so from that perspective, it is our policy to move further.
I want to close this session, but nevertheless you've raised a very important issue there, and we've talked about it before, the move to subscription-based services, the move to need to, when you're procure something that's going to need to be updated constantly. Your department now has responsibility for this through CDDO, but how, and we've discussed this before, but I'd like to ask you again, how are you going to embed this culture into other departments, particularly the Cabinet Office who have commercial procurement, to make sure that this is always considered every single large contract that they procure?
Yeah. So it's certainly part of our Secure by Design framework in terms of ensuring that it is always considered in building new capabilities. But we are also in the centre creating more capability around modern sort of good technology management, and we're working. We've developed a community through our for the Chief Technology Officers across government, and that Chief Technology Officers Council, we're moving that to be a design authority for government. So the Chief Technology Officers of major government departments will set the standard and assure the standard in terms of making sure that everybody is implementing against that need to ensure that there is a consideration around the need to continuously improve and to resource to continuously improve. So funding products and teams, not projects, is the shorthand for it. It is dependent on departments making those allocative decisions around putting the right amount of money into protecting systems going forward, rather than the history that we've seen, which is they build the thing but then don't maintain it.
Thank you very much. Last but by no means least, Lauren Edwards, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just a question that's come to me while we've been discussing this afternoon. There's obviously quite a big debate about work from home and the civil service. How do you ensure that when people are working from home, those cyber defences remain robust? How do you avoid a situation where we might have thousands of civil servants across the country sitting on default Wi-Fi router passwords?
So it's a really excellent question, and I think it's one that we particularly grappled with as part of the response to COVID. So how do we, when we are fundamentally changing our kind of mode of operations, how do we make sure that we maintain appropriate defences and appropriate kind of levels of resilience? I think the first thing to note is that our approach has to be layered. So, the resilience requirements that we set out as per the NCSC cyber assessment framework do not rely on one control to be able to kind of maintain cyber resilience for a given organisation or an individual or their laptop that they are using in any given scenario. We have a series of controls which together give us an appropriate level of resilience. But we also have to make sure that when we're changing working practices, those controls change, and also that for the individuals who are kind of one of our most important defences, we're giving them the right guidance and support to be able to make the right choices, to be able to ensure that they are doing their part in kind of maintaining resilience levels. So one of the things that we've had to do as part of that real kind of fundamental shift in working is make sure that we're also giving the right guidance to individuals for how they can operate securely, and that's something that we do certainly from a central perspective. We support departments in ensuring they're getting the right guidance to individuals, but also departments really focus on that and have done that as part of the kind of the fundamental shift in working.
Thank you. Would you say that every civil servant has been given guidance about how to manage cyber risks when they're working from home?
So one of the things that we do centrally is we ensure that there is, kind of good guidance available to government organisations. It's essentially the responsibility of the individual department to make sure that gets to every individual. But we provide really clear guidance. We also provide centralised training modules that are available on civil service learning. So we do everything we can from the centre, and then we support departments in making sure that gets to individuals.
I thank Joanna Davinson very much for what you do in your department. Kat Little, can I thank you and your team? They work 24 hours a day to keep us safe in the electronic communication sphere, and that's much appreciated. It's been a good session today. We've covered a lot of ground. You're busy people. Thank you very much indeed. An uncorrected transcript of this hearing will be published on the committee's website in the coming days, and the committee will consider the evidence that you've provided us with in such detail and produce a report with recommendations in due course. Order.